Well, good evening, and thank you for coming and joining me again. And I'm sorry for the break in the last few weeks where I've been unable to record. Thank you so much for all of you who sent me messages and emails and all your prayers and thoughts. It's been really great to know that you've all been thinking and praying for me. But I am back and we are ready to go again. So this evening we are carrying on with our webinar series looking at church tech and live streaming and video use for churches. And tonight our session is called What's the Story? And this might be it's going to be the most technical of the webinars that we've done, and it might be quite a change in thinking for some people. So please bear with me and please stick with this evening. Hopefully, as we go through, this is all going to make sense and it's all going to start to click into place for you. But this is a very different subject matter for this evening. It's really about the cherry on the cake. This is the really finessing your videos and how to get the absolute most out of what you're doing, whether it's recorded video or live streaming. The principles that we're going to apply this evening apply to both. But it really is the kind of final technical details that you need to know. So if you have found seminars 1 and 2 a challenge in any way, then tonight might not be the one for you, because this really is for people who have got experience of making videos, who have been doing live streaming, and now just want to know how can we take this on to the next level and sort of really make our videos pop and really make them stand out. That is what this session is all about. So if you are somebody who is still struggling with the more basic stuff that we've covered in the first 2 sessions, you can probably not worry too much about this one. This really is for people with the experience and the background and the knowledge of having done a bit of video and now want to really take it on to the next level. Once again this evening we've got a lot to cover, so let's jump straight in and take a look at the idea of storytelling in our videos. Now straight away, this might be the thing that is going to cause a lot of you to just rethink a lot of what we're doing at the minute, because we're talking about using technology, using video, using cameras and microphones and things in a church context. And I've just introduced this video as being about storytelling and how do we tell a story. And that idea of using video to tell a story as part of a church service might just straight away make you think, hang on a minute, what on earth is going on here? But this is one of the biggest and most helpful principles, that if you can get your head around this idea of storytelling and using video to tell a story, actually it can really help shape a lot of the technology that you use and how you use it when it comes to doing video for your church. So what then do I mean by storytelling? Well, in storytelling, what we are thinking about is, what is it? What's the key message that we're trying to tell with the video that we're putting together? And it's really helpful that you start with this idea in your head. Let's really kind of rewind things to get back to a point where we think, what is it that we want to come across through our videos as we're putting this video together? What is it that we want people to take away from this? And there can be a number of things that you might want to take away from a church service video. For example, it might be that you want to have an opportunity to share the gospel with people who don't know God, people who don't know Christianity, who've got no experience of church or Christianity or God in any way, shape or form, and we want to share something of the good news of Jesus with them. And so this video is all about evangelism and outreach and connecting with people. And so there's our story. That's the story that we want to tell. We want people to be able to connect with this video who have never connected with church before. That's a story. Or it could be that we say, actually, these videos are intended for our congregation. Let's kind of rewind pre-pandemic. The people who were sat on the seats in the church building at that time, that's our church family, our church membership, our church congregation. And right now they physically can't attend our buildings, so we want to be able to share what we would have been doing in the building with them now online to their homes via the internet. That is another story that we could tell here. And the first thing that we need to do is we need to try and work out what is our story For many of us, it might be a bit of both of those two things, and you might say, actually, we want to connect with the existing congregation as they were pre-pandemic, and we want to connect with new people who haven't been a part of the church in the past. The internet gives us opportunity to open up our doors effectively to a broader congregation. So we want to do both of those two things, and we want to connect with both of those two groups of people. And that is all another storyline that you could be telling through this video. All of these things are going to be part of our story and part of how we're going to share our video with people. And so we need to just take a minute to stop and think, what is the story that we want to share? What is the message that we want people to take away and to connect with? And once we've thought about that, we can then start to think, well, how do we use technology to do that then in that case? So that is what we're going to look at this evening, is how do we do that? Once we've worked out what our story is, how do we start to share our story using technology, using cameras and videos and microphones and things like that? What are the elements that we need to think about, and how do we start to put that story together in order to be able to connect with whichever relevant group of people it is that we're trying to connect with? How do we put all these things together? How do we make this work? How do we make this happen? What are the things we need to know in order to tell a story using video? As I say, this is a more advanced video session, so please do bear with me. Again, this might be a video that you want to go back and re-watch several times. You might want to share it with other people. You might want to make this available to perhaps other people in your technical team and things like that. But this is definitely the cherry on the cake, the kind of final finessing of your video and really making it to stand out and to tell that story that you want to share. So hopefully this is what you're after this evening, and hopefully it's going to do that for you. Please do bear with me, and hopefully we will get through this and this will be another helpful video for you. So let's have a look at storytelling with video. How do we do it? What do we need to know? So I'm going to give you 4 areas this evening where we can start to look to use technology to develop this idea of telling a story in our videos. So the first thing that we need to know and we need to understand when it comes to telling stories is going to be camera angles. Getting the right camera angle for your story is so important. It makes a huge difference to what people are going to see and what people are going to understand from your video. But first of all, we need to look at what different camera angles are available to us. What are the options? What could we use as our camera angles? Well, there's a number of different camera angles that you can use. There are a number of different options that you might consider. First of all, you could look at a wide camera angle, something like this, where you've got a lot of space around the person who's talking. You can see things in the background, you can see things in the foreground, you can see a lot of the context of what is going on, and context is so important to your videos. Please, if you take nothing else away from this evening, learn to take context into your videos. Use context, because context is so important in helping us to understand the story, understand what is going on, and understand what is happening in our buildings. So a wide-angled shot is so useful and so helpful when it comes to giving context to your video. And we'll come on to a bit more of that in a minute, because it is really important that you understand what context is all about. But one option is this wide-angled shot. The second camera angle that you might want to use is going to be like a medium wide angled shot, something that's a little bit closer, that will still give you a small amount of context. It also gives you a bit of movement, so you don't have to be quite so precise with your camera position. If you have a preacher who walks around, for example, the tighter you go, the more difficult it's going to be to follow that preacher. So just going slightly wider than that might give you a little bit of breathing space. So you could call this like a medium wide or even a medium close shot. And this will give you just a bit of context and a bit of space for movement, but not be too extremely close. The next shot is going to be a close-up shot, which is a very useful shot. Close-up shots are great for giving detail, and you can really start to see people's facial expressions, you can read their lips, you can start to get a lot from their face generally is what you're going to use a close-up shot for, particularly for things like preaching and things. If your preacher is going to stand still, then a close-up shot can be great, but if they start moving around, you might struggle a little bit the closer you get. And then you could even look at an extreme close-up, and extreme close-ups can be really good for, again, just giving some sense of context as well, but in a different way. And again, we will just have a look at this in a minute, because again, I want to just make sure you really understand what I mean by this. But these shots are all very useful shots and all options that you might want to consider when you're putting your church videos together. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter what you call each of these shots. If there's a term that you want to use that makes more sense to you, then please, by all means, use that. But the idea is that about what is included within the frames. If you think of this as a window, what can you see when you look through that window? What is actually included? And when you're framing up your shot, it's always so important to not just look at what's in the middle, what's the kind of main thing in the shot, but also think about what's in the edges of the shot. What can you see around the edges of the shot? Because all of that is going to help to tell your story, and it's all going to help to share some information to people to help them to connect with or understand something from the video that you are making. So think about corner to corner, edge to edge, every single pixel that is in this video, what is being shown and what is being seen and what is being understood throughout this entire shot. And the closer or the wider that goes, that's going to change, and that's going to look and feel and tell something slightly different. But whatever the angle you're using, a wide, close, medium, extremely close shot, it is going to be important that you think about every aspect of this little window, this little picture that you can see, and what information is being displayed through that shot that you are showing. Okay, so those are some of the possible camera angles that you might like to use. As I say, I wanted to just come back and touch on the idea of context, because I think this is such an important thing and something that often I see people missing in their shots. And context can tell us so much about the story and what is going on and what is happening and what do we want people to understand. And so it is always so important that you have some kind of a wide-angled shot in your videos. That will make so much difference if you include somewhere a wide-angled shot into your video. So to give you an example, if I were preaching right now and we were to use a close-up shot of me preaching, but every now and again I look down, you can't see in that shot what it is that I'm looking down at. Now that could tell you a number of things in this video. That could tell you that to me, the most important thing right now are my shoes. I don't care about you. I don't care about what I'm saying to you. That's not important to me. My shoes are really important to me right now, and that is the most important thing. I just want to keep looking down at my shoes. You have no context and you have no reason to believe that isn't the case. However, if we go for a slightly wider shot and we go for something where we can see the context, you can now see that I have some notes in my hand. And when I'm looking down, I'm reading from my notes. And that now suddenly means that what I'm telling you and what I'm sharing with you is so important, in fact, that I've written notes down so that I can read that for you and I can make sure I get this communicated well to you. Suddenly, that whole picture has changed. It's no longer about my shoes or anything else that's going around. I'm not being distracted by something. Actually, this is of real importance to me, so much so that I've written it down. And suddenly the whole context starts to make sense, and we can see now why it is that I'm looking away, because I've got notes that I'm reading from. So context is really useful for preaching and for anybody who's going to be using any kind of notes. But context can also tell us about the gathering in which we find ourselves. We can have a wide-angled shot that includes things like A congregation, backs of heads of congregation, I think is such an important shot to have. It is such an important camera angle to have, because church is all about the gathered people. Church is the people, not the building. It's something that we've been saying all year long. I mean, we've always said this as a church. We've always said that the church is the people, not the building. But this year, that has been so true and so important for us to make sure we've reinforced that idea, because we haven't had access to our buildings. Has that meant that the church has stopped? No, of course it hasn't, because the church is the people, not the buildings. It's a message that we've always shared, and it's a message that is so important to the hearts of all of our churches. And so we need to share that when we come to making our buildings. So having a shot that's a wide-angled shot with backs of heads of people gathered together, it shows the context of the church people gathered together in one place. So when we have the ability to be able to put a congregation in our buildings, try as much as you can to include a wide-angled shot that includes backs of heads of congregations, because it's not just all about the person standing on the stage, it is about the gathered congregation. And so that context helps to tell something of that story. If you want to be able to connect with all the congregation members who are pre-pandemic part of your church congregation, you want to be that church family again, and you want to be able to share that church family with people on the internet, backs of heads of congregation is so important, because that is going to really help to tell that story. If you want to make that sense of, we are gathering as a family, whether you can gather physically or gather digitally, it doesn't matter, we gather as a family. Get that shot with the congregation in it, because that is going to help tell that story. You do, of course, have to be careful. We need to think about GDPR and safeguarding and all those kinds of things when we start putting cameras on people. We need to make sure that people are aware that they're going to be on camera and that they're going to be potentially filmed. We need to make sure that if they suddenly stand up and walk out of the room, that we're not going to suddenly have some kind of safeguarding issue on our hands because a child who can't be filmed or can't be videoed has suddenly stood up and walked across the room right in front of your camera. Think about all those things, and obviously try to make sure that we do what we can to reduce that from happening. So maybe put your camera, if you're going to get a congregational shot, maybe put it to one side and say that if you're going to be sat on this side, then you'll be on film, and if you definitely don't want to be on film, make sure you go to the other side so that you're not going to go on the camera. Just think that through. But wherever you possibly can, try to make sure you get that shot, because it is such an important one to have. So that's context, and that's the wide-angled shot context. But I did say as well about extreme close-up shots also helping to give context. Now, sometimes we might also consider this shot to be called what we call B-roll. And I'll just take a minute to explain the difference between A-roll and B-roll, because those two things can be really helpful and it can be quite a useful concept to understand. So A-roll is any time where you have a person delivering a message to a camera, and that could be a close-up shot, but it could be a wider shot. I'm delivering my message to the camera, and this is my A-roll. So it's where what you hear, the words that I'm speaking, are also shown on this same camera angle, and you can see and you can hear, and everything that's going on right now is all part of this same piece of footage. B-roll, on the other hand, is where you might cut away to a separate camera angle. So here we can cut away to my notes. Now, it still makes sense that you would be able to see and hear this shot. I can still keep speaking and you can not see my face, but that doesn't particularly matter, because this is all still showing and telling something of the story that's going on. One place where this is particularly useful is communion, and we use this in our church all the time for communion. There's a very awkward moment in communion, and some of you may have discovered this, where it comes to breaking the bread and taking the bread, and to a certain extent the wine, but the bread in particular. Having somebody chewing food on camera is always a very awkward shot to have. It's actually a recognised camera technique, and people use it in film quite a lot as a way to build kind of disgust and slightly kind of awkward, uncomfortable feelings that you kind of, when you see people eating on film, it's generally because they want to make you feel slightly sick and make you feel slightly awkward and uncomfortable. And so when you are seeing people eating food on film, it's generally to try and convey that kind of sense of something slightly unpleasant. And it does make us feel that when you're sat watching somebody chewing, there's this slightly awkward, slightly uncomfortable sense that I don't really enjoy this right now. And that, of course, is the last emotion that we want to convey when it comes to communion. That is not something that we want to have as part of our communion. And so when it comes to breaking bread and taking the bread, there's this moment where the person who's serving it will be on camera chewing bread. And it's not a pleasant shot to have. And so at that moment, what we do in our church is we cut away to an extreme close-up of the communion table. And we have an extreme close-up of the communion table with the elements, the bread and the wine, perhaps a Bible on the table. And we will cut away to this. And so we can have this moment where the person who's taking communion, who's serving communion, will take the bread, break the bread, and just as they take it up to their mouth, we cut off that camera and cut to an extreme close-up of the communion table, and we can just have a few seconds on the communion table. So we're not kind of losing anything. This is still part of the story. It still helps to give that context, and we can understand what is going on. But it just stops us from having to look at somebody chewing bread on camera. And it just kind of helps with that awkwardness. It helps to just make things a lot nicer to watch. It makes things a lot more comfortable for the person actually taking communion as well. None of us really like to have a camera on us while we're chewing a mouthful of food. So it just kind of helps to make things a lot nicer to do. And you could do it at any point. It doesn't have to be in communion. The same thing would be true for sermon notes. Again, you could have an extreme close-up of the preacher's notes. And again, you could just cut away to that for a moment, just to it just helps to share that story of the preacher is looking down because they have notes on a music stand or a lectern or whatever it might be in front of them. And that would be a shot that would work and would be quite useful. You could even cut away to a shot of their hands if they're praying and they've got their hands together. That could be a really nice cutaway shot that you could go to. But all of those shots would be considered B-roll shots because you're not actually talking to the camera at that moment. These are something extra that is added to the story to help give you context and to help fill in some of those moments where perhaps you might just want something to cut away, either because of the awkward nature of what's going on or because it's just something else to give you more of that story, just to tell a little bit more of what might be going on around the shot. And the final thing that you might want to include in terms of context is, again, on the wide-angled shots, you might have things in your shot that help to tell the story of what is going on in your video. So, for example, my wide-angled shot includes my microphone and my light that I have over here. These things help tell the story of this is a technical video. We are talking about technology. We are using technology. This is a video all about how to make use of technology. And so by having technology in this shot, again, it's a very useful, helpful, contextual thing that just helps to tell something of the story of the video. Now, where that might come through in churches, and particularly right now, is things like Christmas trees. We come into Advent and we want to have a contextual shot that tells us something of the story that we're trying to tell, which is the story of Advent. And right now we celebrate Advent by decorating our churches and we put Christmas trees up, and maybe you might have a candle wreath thing. There might be things like that in and around the building, maybe even things like a cross. You might have a cross somewhere in the shot that you want to include to give your story context. It all just helps to build that picture of the message that we're trying to tell. So think about all that's going on, not just the main thing that's going on, but the other things around the edges as well, and how do all those things add together to help to tell your story. Okay, that's camera angles. Hopefully that's made sense to you. That's probably the longest and most in-depth one that we're going to look through. We're going to move on and try and look at some of these other ones and hopefully not spend quite so long on them. But let's carry on and looking at how we tell our story. And this time we're going to look about depth of field. Now, depth of field is something that actually follows on from the last point about camera angles. Depth of field is all about how much of our image is in focus. Now, with this particular shot that I'm using right now, you will see that I'm in focus, but as we look towards the background, things in the background start to go a bit blurry. And if we had anything in the foreground, if I were to push this forwards, you'll probably see that the edges of this become a little bit blurry as well. So anything in front is blurry, anything behind is blurry. How much of the plane of view of what you can see is in focus in the middle, and that's our depth of field. Now, I spoke in the last webinar about how we set exposure by adjusting our aperture. And that is absolutely true, but there is a knock-on effect of adjusting aperture, which is altering our depth of field. And what happens is, as we make our aperture wider, so we go to a smaller f-stop number, we go to an f1.8 or something, as we drop that f-stop down, we get a bigger hole that lets in more light. That, as I say, quite often we need that in a church building. They're quite often a bit darker. We need as much light as we can into the camera to be able to really start to see what is going on. So we open our aperture up. And as we open our aperture up, we allow that light to come into the camera, but the knock-on effect is the wider the aperture goes, the shallower the depth of field becomes. And so what we will find with our videos is that we start to isolate a particular thing. Now, from a storytelling point of view, this can have both a positive and a negative effect. And depending on what it is that we're trying to do at that particular moment, it could be a good thing or it could be a bad thing. So let me explain. If we think of the example of a preacher, and for all intents and purposes, that might as well be me right now, somebody who's just talking, delivering a message and sharing that to the camera, that could be, as I say, that could be a preacher. Now, what we really want to do at that moment, our story needs to make sure that this person is the center of attention at this point in time. Okay, so our story is all about the message that I am sharing with you, and I need to be the center of focus right now. So as we make that depth of field more shallow, what we do is we really isolate the person who is speaking, the person who is in center of that frame, the person who is in the center of that focus. So as that black background becomes more blurry behind me, it automatically makes your eyes look to me rather than anything that might be going on in the background. Now, that can be great, as I say, if I'm the preacher and I'm delivering a message and I really want you to focus on me for a minute, then a shallow depth of field will really help to pull me out of that whatever might be going on in the background. And there's pros and cons to that in terms of wider context. So we spoke a minute ago about if we had a wider camera angle, we might have Christmas trees in the background, we might have a cross in the background, we might have other things going on in the background. Now, it can be nice to be able to see a cross, but if that cross is slightly blurry, then what happens is your focus comes on me. The cross is still there and we can still see it and we can still make out, albeit slightly blurry, but we can make out the shape of a cross. But the focus is on me, the preacher. Now, if we were to change this and we say, actually, at this moment, what we want to do is we're in a time of worship and we want to see the worship band, there might be an argument to say, actually, we don't really want to isolate a single person. We would like to be able to see 2 or 3 people in the worship band. We want to be able to see more of the worship band and not isolate any one person, but actually be able to have a greater depth of field. And so in that context, what you might find you need to do is to actually close down your aperture a little bit in order to make a deeper depth of field so that I can stay in context, but so can the people behind me. And with social distancing, I've really found this to be really quite important at this time, because your band are having to spread out even more than they would normally. We've got 2 meters between everybody, at least 2 meters between all your band members. Suddenly they really start to get spaced out very, very quickly. And if we've got a very shallow depth of field, we can really make that band feel very, very distant from each other. And sometimes it can be slightly problematic from your video storytelling point of view. We want to show the context of a band and a congregation and a church body all gathered together, and a whole group of people all in one place gathering in one moment of time. And yet all we can see is one band member and everybody else is really blurry in the background. And so from a storytelling point of view, you might actually say, we want to increase that depth of field so we can see a bit more of the people in the background, make them feel more like a unit together, and actually start to have a sense of unity and a sense of being together. And so we can close down our aperture, increase our depth of field, and see more of what's going on in the background. And so there could be moments where you want to do that, but you've got to remember the knock-on implication. If we close down our aperture, we have less light coming into our cameras, which means we need to compensate for that. If we think about our little triangle that we had last time, we had our shutter speed, which was fixed. So if we close down our aperture, the only way we can get more light is to increase our ISO. And if we increase our ISO, we probably will also increase the amount of noise in our shot. Lots of knock-on implications that you might have to consider when we're doing this as well. So think about all of those things. It may be that you need to actually add more physical light to your room. You might need to get some lights to shine on your band to brighten them up, because you just physically can't do all that you want to do. And there might be compromises that you have to make, and you might have to say, well, we can't get the whole band pin sharp front to back, but maybe we can just see a bit more of the band in the background, so we don't fully close down that aperture. We just go somewhere as a halfway house, and we slightly increase our depth of field to get a bit more of what's going on in the background. But we can't open it up as much as we'd like to because of the light levels in the room. Think about all of those things and think about how is all of that going to help tell your story. So do you want to isolate a single person? In some cases, yes, you might well want to isolate a single person. Do you want to have more context and more depth? In some cases, yes, you might want to have more context and more depth. It's going to vary from one situation to another, but just think it through and work out, what do you want at that moment? What's going to help tell that story for that moment in your video? The other time shallow depth of field can be really helpful, again, as you're moving to a B-roll shot. If you wanted to use B-roll in the context of something like communion, one way that you could do it is to have a focus on the person breaking bread as they break the bread, but then in that moment shift your focus. And this is definitely getting to a point where you probably want to have a more professional camera with a manual focus lens that you can adjust. But at that moment, as they break the bread, instead of just focusing on the person with the bread, you could shift your focus off this person to the cross that's behind them. If you've got a cross in the context of your shot, just move that focus point so the person eating the bread becomes out of focus and what's in the background becomes in focus. And so your shallow depth of field there could create that B-roll movement to take the focus off the eating of the bread. That's another way that you could use depth of field, just to shift that focus for a moment, to take the attention somewhere else, so we're not sat watching the person with a mouthful of food. We can shift that focus away to something else just for a moment, and then either cut then to another shot or pull back the focus and get back into focus on the person again. But all of that is about depth of field and how do we use that depth of field to tell that story in that moment. And as I say, it's going to vary from one context to another, depending on what it is that you want to say and depending on the light conditions and other things in the room as well. There's a lot of implicating factors on that one. So just think all of that through while you're deciding what you want to tell in that moment, in that part of your story. Okay, next up is camera movement. Now, camera movement can be a two-edged sword. It can be something that can be really helpful at certain times, but it equally can be something that can become quite distracting. And particularly in church context, there are not many occasions where camera movement is going to be useful or important to you, but on the odd occasions where it is, it's worth knowing and understanding that. And particularly as this video today is all about the very advanced, the far more kind of technical, advanced cherry on the cake bits of filmmaking, I'm going to have a quick look at this because for some of you this might be really important and really helpful. But this is definitely something that if nothing that I've said so far has made any sense to you whatsoever, you can completely ignore this one, because this one really is a much more advanced technique that is really not at all essential in church filmmaking. But if everything that I've said so far has made absolute sense and you're thinking, yep, can't wait to use those on Sunday, that's going to be so helpful to be able to start putting some of these things into place, then maybe you're also ready to start learning about camera movement as well, and how and where and when to use camera movement in your videos. So, camera movement. There are several types of camera movement that we can use. And they're all going to do slightly different things for us, and so it's worth just taking a minute to understand what that camera movement is and what it's going to do and how and where and when we can use it. So first of all, we can have camera tripod movement where we're going to do one of two things. Either we're going to pan side to side, or we're going to tilt up and down. And a camera tripod will allow us to do both of those two types of movement quite easily. Now, there's a few times where you might choose to use this. The first and most obvious time is if you have a preacher who's walking around who you need to follow, in which case you're just going to follow them wherever they go. And the type of movement that you use, you just want to keep it smooth and steady. Hopefully, if you're doing camera movement, you will have a tripod with a fluid head. Fluid head tripods are absolutely essential if you're going to try and do any kind of movement on your camera. You really will struggle without that. So fluid head movement is going to be nice and smooth anyway, and you're just going to follow that person, keep them center of the frame, and follow them left to right and up and down if you've got a platform with steps or something where they're going to be moving up and down as well, then you might need to do that. But you're just going to follow them around wherever they're going to go, keep them in the middle of the frame, and follow them around the stage as they walk around. Now, the other way that you might choose to use that type of movement is to introduce a new shot. So if you're going to move from, say, for example, a time of worship into a time of preaching, you might want to have some kind of a transition to take you from one element of your service into another element of the service. And camera movement can be really nice at introducing a new shot, introducing a new idea, a new feel, a new area of your service. And so as you come out of a time of worship into whatever's going to happen next, if, for example, you have your band on one side and whoever's coming up next on the other side, just to pan your tripod off one group of people onto the next person can be a really nice little transition, and it can just help you to take that movement from one thing to another to introduce the next thing coming up. But as I said before, this is definitely a more advanced technique, and if you're not confident with getting that movement and getting that nice smooth transition from one to another, is best avoided. It's better to just have one camera on the worship team, a second camera on whatever's coming up next, and just straight cut from one camera to the other. If you're in any doubt, do a straight cut from one camera to another. Don't try and move that camera across. It is more difficult than it sounds to get that movement nice and smooth and even from one thing to another. If you're going to do it, it needs to be done well and it needs to be done smoothly. If you start bouncing the camera around or having any kind of problems with it, it will very quickly become distracting and off-putting for people. So you need to try and make sure it's nice and smooth, nice and even. You do it well and it can look great. You do it badly and it can look awful. So you do just need to try and really make sure that you get it nailed if you're going to do that type of movement. So really be confident if you're going to do it, and really take your time and make sure you get that movement exactly right. Another option for camera movement is handheld camera movement, and this again is something that is really very advanced and really very technical. Handheld camera movement can be great, but it can also be very, very challenging to do well. So what I would always say with handheld camera movement is, again, this is a really advanced technique, and only do it if you're really confident with it, and also only do it if your camera has inbuilt stabilization, either in the camera or in the camera lens, because it can very quickly start to become quite distracting and off-putting for people. Handheld camera movement can really create tension and energy. For a time of worship, it can be really great. It can really kind of help people to engage in the moment. It can help bring a lot of energy and excitement and passion into your video, so it can really make people kind of feel energetic. And if you want to give that kind of really upbeat, high tempo feel to a time of worship, handheld camera can be great for doing that. That will really help to kind of give that. And I would do that as a second camera, so you'd have a fixed camera on a tripod and then also a camera perhaps shoulder mounted or handheld or something as well. And that combination of cuts from a fixed steady camera to a shoulder mounted camera can really help to give the energy and real feeling of passion to that video. But it can very quickly make people start to feel a bit seasick with all that movement and motion going on as well. So just use it sparingly. I always feel with handheld camera movement that your goal should be to try and stay still. Inevitably you are going to move, and so if you try to stay still and try to keep a steady shot, you will naturally find that your body will move slightly and you will get some movement in that shot anyway. If you try to move while you're holding a camera, you will probably end up creating too much movement, and there will just be this sense of motion sickness because there's just so much movement going on. So try to stay still and your body will naturally move, and that movement will be enough in your shot to be able to make that feel energetic and feel like there's some real drama going on in that shot just by naturally standing still. And so finally, as I've just said, the other type of camera movement is no movement at all and just having a fixed static camera angle. Most of the time for most people, this is going to be what you're wanting to use. And a fixed static camera position is going to be just neutral. It's not going to add anything particularly to the story. It's not going to take anything away from the story. In one sense, you can't really get it wrong. You're just going to have a fixed tripod, fixed position, locked off, not adjusted, and that is going to be nice and simple and easy, and it's going to give you a really fantastic result. The really key thing here is that you get your framing right, and we haven't yet spoken about this. In theory, we could have put this into the camera angles bit at the beginning, but I'll talk about it here now. When it comes to framing a shot and working out the spacing around things, the best thing to know and understand is the rule of thirds. And if you imagine your shot, whichever type of camera angle that you use, divided into 3 sections vertically and 3 sections horizontally, you want to try and aim to have people's eye line on that top third line. So you're always going to try and have eyes on the top third. So don't try and put heads in the middle of your shot. They're always going to be too low down if you put your head in the middle. It's always eyes on the top third. And you also either want to have a shot with symmetry, so you have the shot lined up straight down the middle, or if people are going to be off to one side, you want them so their eye direction is heading towards the center of the image. So if I'm off to one side, but I'm looking in, you want me to be looking into the middle of the shot. If I turn around and look this way, I'm looking out of the shot. I'm looking at something that you can't see over there. And that makes you want to look as to what's going on over there. Whereas if I turn this way, I'm looking into the middle of the shot, which is going to draw your eyes into the middle of this frame, and you're going to look into whatever is going on in this shot right now. So if I'm the key thing in this shot, your eyes are going to be drawn into the middle and then onto me, because that's where I'm looking into the middle, so you're going to follow that eye line of me. So always make sure you're looking into the center of the shot if you're off to one side. Okay, and so we come to our fourth and final point for this evening, and this is going to be about audio. And so when we think about audio in terms of telling our story, we're going to think about 4 aspects of audio that are all going to help to build up this idea of our story. So the first thing you need to think about is, as I said before, your A-roll. What is the main thing that is going on in our video section? So if we think about a preacher, our A-roll video is about the person speaking, and you can look at me and see me speaking. But also I need some audio to support that. And so we need to have some type of microphone that is going to pick up that person. Most of the time in church context, most church situations, you're going to be looking at maybe like a lapel radio mic or maybe a headset radio mic. Normally that's probably going to be what you're going to be using. That's going to work really, really well. As I've said before, whatever microphone that you use for your preaching normally is almost certainly going to be absolutely fine here. So just take whatever PA system you might have in the building, use that, use the microphones from that, and you're probably going to get that audio sorted pretty quickly and easily. A-roll for a worship band would be the other thing to also think about, and just think about what do we need for the worship band. Again, hopefully most of that is going to be covered by what you already have. You probably already have a PA system, and worship band will probably be going through that. But just think about what I said last time about acoustic sound versus amplified sound. Anything that's being thread through the PA system is going to be fine, because you're going to be able to capture that and to be able to put that to your video. Anything that isn't being captured by your PA system is just going to be lost completely. So think about things like drums, acoustic guitars, acoustic pianos, even singers possibly are not going to be picked up as well, although probably okay if they've got vocal mics that they're using and using them well. So think about all those various elements of sound, what is being picked up, what is being amplified, what's being fed through the PA system. Maybe you need to add some extra mics to pick up the worship band, but you need to make sure that what can be seen can also be heard. So if you've got a camera pointing at your worship band and you can see a drummer blasting away in the background, but you can't hear any drums, that's going to be a really weird video. You need to make sure that if you can see somebody in the video who's doing something, that you can also hear them and that they're being mic'd up and being fed through. That is your A-roll. Your A-roll sound has to match your A-roll video. So you need to make sure those two things are both supporting each other, and that audio is at least as important as the video, if not more so in some cases. So you really need to make sure you're capturing that audio well. You also need to think about the congregational singing as well when it comes to the worship. As I say, with the idea of storytelling in our videos, we need to make sure that the idea of the gathered church is really important in what we're doing and what we're sharing. So you need to make sure that people can not just see the backs of the heads of the congregation, but they can also hear the congregation, and that you are somehow miking up the congregation to add that sound into the singing. Obviously when congregational singing is allowed again. make sure that that is part of your story and part of what you are sharing through your video. So make sure you've got a way to be able to mic up the congregation so that they can be heard as well as seen in those shots. So the third thing then you need to think about is going to be ambience, and sometimes we call this the room sound. And this is sort of what the congregational singing would be. This is the ambient sound of the room. So as you have a congregation singing, that would be part of the ambient sound in the background that you want to make sure you can capture. But that's not only going to be true of times when there's singing happening, but it's also going to be true when there's things like preaching happening. If the preacher tells a joke and there's laughter as a response from that joke, you want to make sure that that is captured and put through onto your video so people can hear that laughter, people can hear the responses, can hear what is happening in the room, what is going on. So anybody who's responding to the preaching, anybody who's responding to a testimony story or something that's being shared from the platform, all of that can be seen and can be heard in the room, in the context altogether. So just try to make sure that what you can see can also be heard as well. And then finally, the fourth thing when it comes to audio is think about music and how music might help to tell the story and to maybe even tie the story together, to bring elements together. There are examples of this for things like introducing a sermon. For example, we have a particular little video clip that we've created. So when we come out of whatever's going to happen before the sermon, as we come out of that into our time of preaching, we have a little video clip that introduces that, and it has some background music that plays over the top. And what we tend to do is we bring this little video clip in, and when people see this video clip, that they know that we're coming to our sermon time. But what we might do is we'll cut the video away and cut to the camera of the preacher, but just carry that audio track playing for a few seconds just as the preacher sort of settles themselves and gets ready to preach. And it just ties you through from what was happening before into this time of sermon. You have this audio link that connects you through from one thing to another. And so just think about, is there a piece of music that you can use that can just do that and that can just introduce the sermon? So when people hear this audio start to play, they know that, oh, okay, we're heading into the sermon now. And that little audio link will just connect you through into a sermon. Likewise, we do the same thing into communion as well. If we're having a time of communion, we'll use a piece of just quiet, gentle background music that we can use for communion that just helps to tell something of that story and to connect those elements together. Like I spoke about with the camera movement, where you might pan the camera across from one thing to another, music and audio can help to connect you from one thing to another. So that was the last thing that I had. Those are my 4 big tips for storytelling for church video use. I actually just wanted to finalise with a bit of a bonus, if you like, of a few extra tips that I didn't really feel like fitted into any of the other categories, but just some really helpful tips to hopefully help you as you form your videos, as you make your either recorded videos or live streamed videos. A few little bonus tips here for you. The first one is to see what you hear. And I kind of alluded to this a little bit with the audio thing, but you want to make sure that what you see and what you hear tie together. So not only is it about, if you can see a drummer playing drums in the background of your video, make sure you can hear that drummer as well. As an example, if somebody in the congregation starts coughing, now you might want to make sure you cut away, not necessarily to a person coughing at that moment, but to cut away to the congregation at that moment. If you hear a sound that's being made by the congregation in the background, it can be very distracting for people to suddenly hear a noise but have no idea where that noise has come from. So if you hear something happen in the congregation, a cough or a sneeze or a laugh or whatever it might be from the congregation, cut away to your backs of head shots so that you can see that there's a congregation in that room. So the people who are sat at home watching this video who suddenly hear this noise, what was that noise? Where did that come from? Well, I can cut away to my congregation and I can say, hey, look, we're sat in a room with some other people in here. You might have just heard a noise. It's because we're sat in a room full of people. That's where that noise just came from. See what you hear. If you hear something happen in the room, try to show it, or try to show where it might have come from, because if you don't, people are going to be very distracted and people are going to start thinking, well, where did that noise come from? What was that noise? There was some sort of strange noise in the video. They've no longer listening to the sermon at all. They're now just thinking, what was that noise? Where did that noise come from? That was a strange noise. What's that noise all about? No idea what the sermon's on about right now. I'm trying to think about what that noise was, because that was the thing that I've just heard and that's what my attention has been drawn to. But all I can see is a preacher on the stage, and he certainly didn't cough because I've been watching him and he didn't cough, but I could hear a noise. Where's that noise? Completely distracting, completely lost the plot of what's going on in the video. To bring that attention back, you need to show them the context of this is a room full of people. You might have heard some background noise because there's people here in this room. Cut away to that backs of head shot for a moment. Let that settle for a second, and they can just say, oh yeah, there's people in that room. That now makes sense. My brain can settle back down again, and now we can get back onto focusing onto the sermon. Tip number 2 is to keep it simple. Simplicity is so important for our videos. If you start to overcomplicate things, particularly with the camera movement thing that we were talking about earlier on, camera movement can so quickly become a distraction. Subtlety is key with that, and if you can keep things simple, keep things subtle, you can really help to add to your story. But as soon as you start to overdo it, if you start to do too much of that kind of thing, it can very quickly just become a complicated, messy thing that doesn't really add anything any longer. It's now just becoming almost me showing off my camera skills by moving the camera around. I'm now just doing a shoulder-mounted camera just because I want to do a shoulder-mounted camera. It's no longer about telling the story any longer. It's now just about me doing something just for the sake of doing something. A simple shot that tells the story is far more useful to you than the most complicated, elaborate camera sequence that really just becomes a distraction. So keep it simple. Simplicity is key. And always, always, always remember the story. What is the story that you want to tell through this video? And keep that at the center of everything that you do. And always ask yourself, will me doing this thing help tell the story? And if the answer is yes, then do it. And if the answer is no, don't. Always keep the story at the center of what you're doing right now. And just think about, does this thing, whatever it is that I'm going to do, does this help to tell the story? Does this help to emphasize what it is we're trying to share right now? And if it doesn't, then just don't do it. There is no need to add extra complicated camera movement or camera sliders or anything like that into your shot if it's not going to help to tell the story. If there's no purpose for it, don't do it. Keep it simple and tell the story. So that is it. We are at the end of this, our third and final session. Next week we are going to be coming back again, but we're not going to be doing a pre-recorded one. Next week is going to be on Zoom, and it's going to be a discussion-based session. So if you want to come and join us for that fourth and final webinar, make sure you get in touch with the YBA office and they will give you the login details for the Zoom conversation, and we can have some discussion. I'm going to be asking some questions and we're going to have lots of opportunity for just conversation around some of the things that we've talked about, and also some other things as well, but all around the idea of technology and how do we use technology in our church video context, church online, whatever platform you might be using. If this video has been helpful, please like, share, comment, subscribe, all those normal things. And as I've said before, it's really great if you can share this with people either from your church or from other churches. If there are people who you think might find this helpful, please do share it with them. Take care, stay safe, and I will see you next week.